When the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down, most people thought they understood the story immediately. The story they assumed was catastrophe. 150 oil tankers stranded outside the strait. Roughly one-fifth of the world's daily oil supply suddenly trapped behind a geopolitical choke point. Prices surging past $100 a barrel, Canadian gasoline jumping 40 cents a liter in 3 weeks. Asian manufacturing hubs staring at the possibility of a fuel shock large enough to cut directly into production. That was the obvious story, but it was not the most important one. The more important story was quieter, and because it was quieter, most people missed it. When the old energy artery broke, Asia did not first solve the problem by racing toward Europe or by trying to bargain its way back through the Gulf. It started making calls across the Pacific to Calgary. That is the story I want to explain, because I do not think this was just an oil crisis. I think this was a geography lesson. And the lesson was brutal. In a world where choke points can shut overnight, the most valuable barrel is not simply the cheapest barrel or the closest barrel. The most valuable barrel is the barrel that can still move without asking permission from a war zone. That is why Canada suddenly mattered so much. Look at the structure. South Korea usually gets around 70% of its oil from the Middle East. That is not a small exposure. That is a strategic dependency. If Gulf flows are disrupted, South Korea does not experience that as a bad headline. It experiences it as a direct threat to its industrial metabolism. The same logic applies across much of Asia. Factories do not run on speeches about resilience. They run on molecules. The molecules have to arrive. And when Hormuz stopped behaving like a reliable artery and started behaving like a battlefield, the question for Asian buyers became very simple. Where can we get real supply quickly at scale at a tolerable price without having to run a geopolitical gauntlet just to keep the lights on? That is the moment when Canada stopped looking like a secondary supplier and started looking like a strategic answer. Official data released this week showed that Canada's refined petroleum sector just posted the highest production year in its history in 2025. Reaching 117.1 million cubic meters, crude production averaged 5.3 million barrels per Dalton Y. Those are not just impressive numbers. In the middle of a global energy shock, they become political facts because the key issue in a crisis is not abstract capacity. It is deliverable capacity. And that is where the Trans Mountain Pipeline changes everything. For years, people talked about Canadian pipeline politics as though it were a provincial fight or a domestic environmental battle or a familiar North American argument about infrastructure. All of that was true, but it missed the larger strategic meaning. The strategic meaning is now obvious. If Canadian crude can move across the country, reach the Pacific coast, and then cross the North Pacific directly to Asia, it bypasses nearly every major geopolitical choke point that turned the Middle East crisis into a global panic. That route is long, but long is not the same thing as dangerous. And in energy markets, a long, secure route is often worth more than a short, vulnerable one. That is the shift. The Pacific route from Canada is not glamorous. It does not have the drama of the Gulf. It does not sit at the center of every military map. But precisely because it avoids all that drama, it suddenly becomes invaluable. That is why Chinese buyers have become the single largest customers on the pipeline. That is why South Korean refiners move so quickly. This is not coincidence. This is systems logic. When one route becomes politically radioactive, the world starts paying a premium for the route that still looks boring. And boring, in a crisis, becomes a strategic asset. This is why I think the real winner in the early phase of the Hormuz shock was not simply an oil producer. It was a producer with geography on its side. Now, let us push this one layer deeper because the story gets even more interesting when you stop looking only at Asia and start looking south for years. The basic assumption in North American trade politics was that the United States had overwhelming leverage over Canada because the American market was simply too large, too close, and too dominant for Ottawa to meaningfully resist long-term pressure. That assumption still contains a lot of truth, but physical markets do not always obey political arrogance. Down on the U.S. Gulf Coast, many American refineries are specifically built to process heavy crude. They cannot just swap in any random barrel and keep operating efficiently. Historically, they have depended on some mix of Canadian supply, Middle Eastern supply, and Venezuelan supply. But now Middle Eastern supply is unstable, Venezuelan supply is unreliable, and Canadian supply has acquired a premium Asian outlet that does not require American permission. That changes the leverage suddenly. Canada is not simply a neighbor trying to preserve access to the American market. Canada is holding a form of physical leverage that both Asia and the U.S. Gulf Coast want at the same time. That is what makes the upcoming trade negotiations so much more interesting than most commentary admits. Because this is no longer just about tariffs on steel or disputes over autos or the usual ritualized trade irritations. This is about who gets access to a supply stream that matters more in a world of maritime disruption than it did in a world of stable globalization. And then there is the Prairie Connector pipeline proposal, which could move roughly 450,000 barrels a day south into the United States if approved. That project matters not only because of volume, it matters because it puts a physical bargaining chip on the table. Canada is no longer negotiating purely in the language of market access and diplomatic goodwill. It can negotiate in the language of actual barrels. That is a very different conversation. This is why I think the Hormuz crisis did something psychologically important inside Canada too. For years, energy debates in Canada were often framed in defensive, almost apologetic terms. The sector was large, yes, but politically contested, important, yes, but surrounded by fights over climate, pipelines, provincial identities, and federal posture. Then suddenly a global shock arrived, and the thing Canada had quietly built over the past few years started doing exactly what strategic infrastructure is supposed to do. It absorbed the shock, it gave foreign buyers an alternative, it created bargaining power, it created revenue, and it reminded Canadians that hard infrastructure is not an embarrassment. It is leverage that matters economically in a very direct way. When a sector this large breaks records, it does not stay inside boardrooms. Pension funds benefit, provincial royalty revenues rise, fiscal pressure eases, governments suddenly find room for things they could not easily afford before. Even recent moves like fuel tax relief become easier to absorb when energy revenues are surging. That is the domestic side of leverage. But now we have to say the hard part too, because a high quality analysis cannot stop at the celebratory version of the story. This advantage is real. It is also temporary unless Canada locks it in. That is the next challenge. Whenever Middle Eastern routes normalize, some buyers will inevitably go back to the geographically closer suppliers they relied on before. That is just market logic. Pipeline capacity to Canada, as West Coast also has hard physical limits right now. That system maxes out at around 890,000 barrels a day. In other words, the opportunity is huge, but it is not infinite. That is why the current moment matters so much. A crisis has opened a window. Windows close if Canada wants this moment to become structural rather than cyclical. It has to use the crisis to secure long-term relationships, not just collect short-term windfall gains. That means contracts. That means infrastructure confidence. That means reliability. That means turning emergency demand into durable trade architecture. And that is not easy because the other structural constraint is climate breaking production records, creates immediate economic strength, but it also intensifies the friction with long-term emissions goals, carbon pricing debates, and the political question of how an advanced state reconciles resource leverage with net zero commitments. That contradiction does not disappear just because the market suddenly needs your barrels. In fact, success can make the contradiction sharper. The more strategically useful Canada's oil system becomes, the harder it is to pretend the country can simply govern its way out of these trade-offs with slogans. This is what real statecraft looks like. You do not get to choose between leverage and tension. You get both. And I think that is why this moment matters beyond the immediate crisis. The old globalization story assumed that efficiency was the highest good. The new story is different. In the new story, resilience beats efficiency, security beats elegance, the safe route beats the shortest route, and the supplier that can still move when the world breaks becomes more important than the supplier that merely looked optimal under normal conditions. That is what Canada just proved. When the global energy system cracked, the map did not simply freeze. It rerouted. And it rerouted toward the infrastructure that had quietly been built for exactly this kind of moment. That is the deeper lesson here. This is not only a Canadian success story, it is a reminder that in geopolitics, the most valuable infrastructure often looks excessive right up until the day it becomes indispensable for years. People argued over pipelines as though they were old economy relics, expensive political headaches, or provincial vanity projects. Now, one of them is helping reshape how Asia thinks about North American energy. That is not a footnote, that is history moving through steel. And if you want the whole story compressed into one line, it is this. When Hormuz stopped looking like a highway and started looking like a trap, Canada stopped looking like a backup plan and started looking like the secure route the world suddenly needed.